So here's where we are today. I want to take you back a minute to when this legislation was being debated and ultimately enacted. We encourage members of the General Assembly to make the implementation deadline contingent upon funding, since there was no associated funding with this legislation. Just as we did with the DNA database legislation some years ago. We did file a fiscal impact statement initially, and we said at the time, because we didn't know how much it was going to cost, I think the figures that we put on the fiscal impact statement was $250,000 to $500,000. Ultimately, the bill was enacted and the 2-year clock started to run upon the signature of the governor. Again, without any dedicated funding. The LAC rightly notes SLED has no oversight authority over the entities required to participate under the law, like local law enforcement agencies and medical facilities. However, throughout the report, they mistakenly lead the General Assembly and the public to believe that the statute granted SLED wide-ranging authority, including the authority to go into every law enforcement agency in the state of South Carolina and demand access to every sexual assault kit for the purposes of creating an inventory. To be clear, the bill was enacted, gave SLED no authority to promulgate any regulations or enforce any inaction by local law enforcement, medical facilities, SAME nurses, or prosecutors. Section 1G of the statute simply says, SLED shall establish guidelines to ensure the statewide sexual assault kit tracking system protects victims' information from disclosure to non-participating entities. If you look on page 48 of their report, recommendations 18, 19, 20, and 21, again, convey authority upon SLED where there is no such authority that was specifically given by the General Assembly in this legislation. SLED has no and was not granted any authority by this legislation to promulgate regulations, to establish required time frames for stages of sexual assault kit processing. SLED has no authority by this legislation to require that all reported sexual assault kits are picked up by law enforcement and enrolled in the tracking system within 3 days. SLED has no authority granted by this legislation to require that all reported sexual assault kits are delivered by the law enforcement agency to the forensic laboratory within 7 days. And we have no authority granted by this legislation to require all forensic laboratories in South Carolina to process all sexual assault kits within 30 days of receipt. It is noted SLED, through internal policy, could require SLED's forensic lab to process all kits within 30 days. And SLED is currently utilizing an external vendor paid for by federal grant dollars to analyze sexual assault kits to help reduce the backlog with that goal in mind. We have legislation that currently requires that law enforcement agencies that have identified gang members, the legislation says that they must report those gang members to SLED to be entered into our GangNet database. But that doesn't always happen. We have no stick there. There's also legislation that says that when they have a full custody arrest, that their fingerprints will be sent to SLED within 3 days. And that doesn't always happen. There's legislation that says that if you're arrested on a felony charge, that you will have a buccal swab taken, DNA sample taken, and submitted to SLED laboratory to be put in our DNA database. And that doesn't always happen. And SLED has no control over these agencies that legislation is intended for. A large number of these kits, there's a known assailant. In other words, we know who committed that sexual assault, or law enforcement knows who committed that sexual assault. We focus on those kits where minors involved. We focus on those kits where we have an unknown assailant. As Major Huey said, we have some agencies that during the course of their investigation, they determine, whether a sexual assault, whether it's a sexual assault or whether it was consensual. And sometimes that leads to charges, sometimes it doesn't. But we spend our efforts initially, again, on trying to make sure that we get those sexual assault kits on minors and unknown assailants. Because again, a large number of these kits, I think the number is about 56% of these kits, we have a known assailant or acquaintance involved in these sexual assault kits. Again, we've got law enforcement agencies, law enforcement departments that don't have 24-hour coverage. And we have one-man departments in the state and two-person departments in the state. And so, again, the local sheriff's department ends up having to, try to provide law enforcement service to those citizens that live in those small communities, even though they have a police department. We see this, we've seen this again since, I go back to 2020, we've seen this since COVID and the George Floyd situation where we've had our agents going in and working shifts in small departments around the state, Blackfield's, Allendale's, Estill's, Chester, actually working shifts, taking calls for service because those small agencies do not have the personnel they need to provide the citizens of their community public safety. I'm never going to say we can't do better, okay? I can tell you that we at SLED strive every day to do everything we do better. And we learn lessons every day of things that we, as I tell people, I tell the chiefs and sheriffs, solicitors, we're not perfect. We do the very best we can. This was a difficult time, when we were wanting to meet, but trying to figure out how we were going to meet. This was a time when we were learning how to meet on Teams or, I don't know, like I say, I'm not a technology guy, but we were trying to figure out how we could meet and talk to one another and communicate with one another. And so it was a difficult time to try and start something like this. Again, this law was signed May of 2020 in a 2-year deadline. And so I think, again, we would love to work with the General Assembly when legislation like this is passed, when mandates on us are passed, to really have communication about how long realistically do we think this is going to take. Again, if you use LAC's study, about every other state was in that same category, same time frame that we were in. And not all of them had to compete with COVID because some of them were in it before we were. And again, the DNA database legislation is the one I always use. Is we asked for, and the legislature granted us that leeway to get the program started, but not until it was funded. And again, that program, we got it stood up. When it was funded, we had done the background, we had done the research, we knew what we needed to do, and when it was funded, we were able to put it in place. We have provided video training both for fingerprinting and for collection of buccal swabs, the DNA swabs. And we did that because we know that there's a lot of turnover in our detention facilities, and we offered that video. We also have offered to send our folks out personally to do that training. So, is that something that that they have, you know, one person specifically trained in? I mean, I would hope that anybody working in a detention facility that is in the process of booking someone in would be trained to take a DNA sample and obviously a fingerprinting. But again, we have provided video training on both of those because of the amount of turnover rate we know that there are in detention facilities. If the victim goes to a medical center and has a SANE nurse and they collect a sexual assault kit, then that sexual assault kit would be picked up by law enforcement. And law enforcement would then, if they're enrolled in this system, they would enroll that kid in this system. And again, they may not send it to us initially. They may do some investigation first before they would send it to us. So they could possibly hold it for some period of time, depending upon what the circumstances were, what the facts were of the case, until they decided to send it to us to be analyzed. We provide the kits to them. If they send those kits to us, then it's our responsibility to get them analyzed. And obviously we coordinate run the tracking system.